All right, so if I recall, we didn't quite finish with chapter 4 last time. There's one thing that I'd like to pick up in chapter 4 before we move on, recognizing that we barely have enough time to do chapters 5 and 6 this morning. So we'll spend just a moment, because if you look in chapter 4, starting in verse 46, this is a story of the second miracle, the second sign that takes place in John. So we're all pretty familiar with this story because the way that the story is framed also occurs in the synoptics. There's a person who comes to Jesus and asks for healing on behalf of someone else who is not present, right? So in this story, an official comes to Jesus and says that his son is sick, and Jesus says, "Go, your son will live." And the man believes, because when he heads back, his servant comes out and tells him, "Hey, your son is made well." And it happened at the right time when Jesus said that he would be made well, right? So the man, he believes based on receiving the blessing that he asked for, the miracle that he asked for. The last verse in chapter 4 is, "This was now the second sign that Jesus did when he had come from Judea to Galilee." Okay? So the first one being the wedding at Cana. This story also kind of takes place in Cana, although Jesus has been to the temple and back by this time. We will see more signs happening in these next chapters. There's debate about whether the signs that Jesus is performing are attached to discourses, is what they're called, long teachings, monologues of Jesus. People go back and forth. It's not really clear if, hey, there's this sign and it directly relates to this speech that Jesus gives, or if there just happen to be a lot of signs and a lot of speeches. For this one in particular, it's of note, it's of interest to me, that this is also very similar to stories that we hear. Not necessarily that this is the same thing that we've read in the synoptics, but that Jesus performs miracles in this way, where people don't even have to be present, right? The son who's healed is not healed based on his own faith, right? The son doesn't have anything to do with Jesus. He's not there. It seems like the son is not even healed based on the official's belief, right? Because the official doesn't believe until after the son is healed, right? And so we tend to think there are times when Jesus says, "Your faith has made you well." But there are times when that is not what's happening, that somebody is made well despite their lack of faith, right? We'll see that happen again in these chapters, in chapter 5 actually. So let's start in 5. We have there's just so much to get through. Chapter 6 is a really long chapter. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. It's not clear what feast this is. Elsewhere, John indicates, it was the Feast of Passover, it was the Feast of Pentecost, it was the Feast of Booths, whatever. He doesn't indicate what it is. That's probably because it doesn't exactly matter which one it is. We're not really sure. It could be Passover, it could be something else. There is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. This is very specific. This is very archaeologically accurate. These types of details are what make people think that the author of this book was somebody who lived in Jerusalem. Somebody who is so familiar with the specifics of this is exactly where this event occurred. There's this pool and it's right by this gate and it has 5 colonnades. Colonnades are so there's a pool, and I think the way I understand it, it's kind of shaped like a trapezoid, maybe like this. And it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pillars in the middle of it that are holding up the roof. Okay, that's the colonnades. We know where this is. Archaeologically, in current Jerusalem, we know where this is. You can go and look at the colonnades, the pillars that are, ruins now. But it exists. It's in as far as I know, it's in the Muslim district of the old city in Jerusalem. You can go there. It has the 5 colonnades. You can see what we're talking about. So this makes people think that the author here was probably not necessarily a Galilean fisherman. We don't know. Well, we talked about this on week 1. We're not confident. We don't know for sure one way or the other. But these sort of details are very specific. In these pools lay many invalids who were blind or lame or paralyzed. One man was there who had been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the water when the water is stirred up. And while I'm making my way, someone else steps down ahead of me." Jesus said to him, "Stand up, take your mat, and walk." At once the man was made well, and he took up his mat and began to walk. Okay? So, a couple of things. Can somebody read John 5, verse 4?
For an angel went down at a certain time into the pools and stirred up the water. Then whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was made well of whatever disease he had, which is one of the later manuscript editions.
So I see you guys looking around confused.
Yeah.
You all don't have a verse 4 at all, right? Right? This is one of my favorite things to talk about. So it's in parentheses. Some people don't have it at all. Mine has it as a little footnote. Some manuscripts have verse 4.
Mine has a footnote.
So a lot of your Bibles will add it, but almost all of them will indicate it does not belong. That it is not original to the text. Right? Just yours has it in parentheses?
Mine is on the bottom.
Okay, yeah.
Mine's on the bottom.
So there's a reason for this.
Okay.
In the 1100s, when people are going through and adding chapter and verse, this verse was in. It existed in the manuscript and people didn't question it. And so when they're going through and saying this is verse 1, this is verse 2, this is verse 3, this is verse 4 was there. And so they gave it verse 4. Now, looking back and over the last 200 years, we've discovered more manuscripts and we have heightened our kind of scrutiny of which manuscripts we trust. The oldest and best manuscripts do not have verse 4 in them. And so most scholars interpret it to be, there seemed to be a confusion about what was actually going on with this pool, and verse 4 was added. It's called an interpolation. It's entered in, right? So it's inserted into the text in order to add clarity to what's going on. Okay? So it's, if you just read it, there's people laying by this pool. One man was there for a long time, and he says, when the water is stirred, there's no one there to put me into the water. That's kind of confusing if you don't have like the background detail. And so it seems like a later scribe added the detail to explain what's going on in verse 4. And it could very much be the way that we work. We have our book and we write notes on the side, right? We add, oh, this is some clarifying detail. So somebody could have done that, and then somebody comes along later and sees the note on the side and thinks, oh, this is supposed to be in as a verse, but they left it out by accident and put it on the side. So I'm supposed to come in and input it into the verse. And then the next copy that comes out has that in the text. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. What seems to be happening is there is an ancient belief. It's kind of like superstitious. They believed that an angel would come to these waters and literally aggravate them. And the first person who gets into the water after it's been aggravated by this angel is cured of whatever disease. So this man is complaining he can't be the first one in. And by the time he does get in, the first person has already been healed and there's nothing left for him. I don't think, that doesn't seem to be the way that God would operate in like doling out blessings to the strongest and fittest, right? The strongest disabled person who can get there, or probably like the wealthiest who can hire somebody to throw them in the water at the right time. That doesn't seem to be the way that God actually operates. This seems to be very superstitious. From what I understand about this actual pool, it is fed by an aqueduct, but also attached to underground springs. And so it's filled by the aqueduct, but every now and then the underground springs will come and fill it up themselves, and that aggravates the water. And then the people seeing that attach to it supernatural significance. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I don't know that that's actually what's going on. It's what this person that Jesus is interacting with thinks is going on. And Jesus cuts right through all the superstition, right? You don't need to be in the water. You don't need me to throw you in there first, and you don't need to pay me to do it. You're good. Right? Stand up and walk. What does Jesus do to actually heal the person?
Speaks it.
He doesn't do anything.
He speaks to him.
It's like the in the synoptics, the guy with the withered hand, right? Jesus doesn't do anything. He says, show me your hand. And he shows it to him and it's healed, right? Because then the accusers come and say, you can't be healing on the Sabbath. And Jesus says, I didn't do anything, right? I told him to show me his hand, and he did. Jesus tells him, take up your mat and walk. This is probably like, the way I picture it is like a yoga mat, right? Like it's made of straw. You can wrap it up and like just carry it over your shoulder. It's not really a burden unless you're disabled, right? Like if you can't walk, then yeah, walking around with your mat on your shoulder is going to be difficult. And so the walking with your mat, carrying your mat, exemplifies, it demonstrates the fullness of the miracle. It's not like we picture like the faith healer kind of people who go around and say like, you're healed, walk, and then the person is like still crippled the next day. The point of the take up your mat is to demonstrate, it's not like an artificial, you're fine for a minute and then you're back to where you were. They're actually healed. He's actually made well. Good? Now, we talked about this a second ago with the official. Did the man do anything to deserve the healing from Jesus? Did he demonstrate any faith? I mean, not really, right? He's kind of, Jesus asked him a question and he doesn't exactly answer it. Do you want to be made well? And he said, sir, I have no one to put me in the pool.
He feels the need.
Yeah. So he might be saying like, well, obviously I want to be made well. I'm here, but I don't have the ability to get into the water first, right? So maybe that's what he's saying. Or maybe he's complaining, right? I've been here 38 years and nobody has come along to help, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to tell. As we read more about this person, I think he's complaining.
Right.
I don't think he's
whining.
I don't have a very charitable reading of this guy, okay? So we keep looking. That day was the Sabbath, it says at the end of verse 9. So the Jews, these are like the Jewish officials in Jerusalem, okay? The Jews said to the man who had been cured, it's the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to carry your mat. And he answered them, the man who made me well said to me, take up your mat and walk. And so they asked, who is the man who said to you, take it up and walk? Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was because Jesus had disappeared in a crowd that was there. Okay, so there's a couple things going on. I'm teaching this Torah class at the university, so we've been talking about this a lot. We have a written Torah. We have the laws in the Old Testament, right? The actual written rules passed down by Moses, recorded in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. What they are citing here is not written Torah. What develops over time between the time of Moses and Jesus' time is what they call oral Torah. It's recorded oral traditions that carry the same weight as the laws of God. Most of it is like ways to interpret or ways that we interpret those rules. So we know there's a rule, you can't work on the Sabbath. That is a written law. Now, they go through over centuries and they explain, they draw out, what does that specifically mean? Some people take a pretty lenient approach, which is kind of where we land as like Christians saying we obey the Sabbath, of whatever job you do during the week, you're not allowed to do that job on the Sabbath, right? So if you're a school teacher, you're not allowed to teach school on, we would say Sunday, right? Or if you're a lawyer, you're not allowed to practice law on Sunday.
Which is actually Saturday, though.
Right. But there develops a more stringent adherence to these laws, which is what we call Pharisaism, right? They had super strict rules. One of them was you are not allowed to carry anything outside of your own home, right? So you can carry stuff around in your house, but on the Sabbath, you can't take stuff out of your house and carry it. You can't carry a purse. You can't carry a mat over your shoulder. You can't carry a backpack. You can't do it. To where Jewish communities develop, I don't really understand the structure of it, but there are buildings or coverings big enough to get around that rule so that you can actually like get from your house to synagogue without leaving the building so that you can carry stuff. So like they develop super strict rules, but then also develop ways around the rules, right? So what they're talking about here is it's not lawful for you to carry your mat. That is a strict oral law that exists in the time but is not in the Old Testament. Does that make sense? So Jesus is arguing about that. He's not arguing about actually breaking Torah. He's arguing about the interpretation of Torah that exists in the time. And there already exist people who disagree about it in Jesus' time. Pharisees and Sadducees disagree about how to interpret these laws. The Pharisees just happen to be the most prominent arguers, opponents of Jesus. So we tend to think of Jesus as saying like things that are completely un-Jewish, and he's really not. He's very much within like the Jewish realm of disagreeing and having disputes about what it means to obey Torah, or what it means to obey the Sabbath. Good? What does the man do though? When they come and say, hey, you shouldn't be carrying your mat, who does he blame?
Jesus.
He blames the man who healed him. He's been ill for 38 years, and the first chance he gets, he blames the guy who healed him to try to get out of trouble, right? And so then what happens? Jesus comes and meets him. This is verse 14. Jesus found him at the temple. He did not come to find Jesus. He didn't come and say, hey, thanks for healing me. Jesus had to come and find him later. Mm-hmm. And Jesus says, see, you've been made well. Do not sin anymore so that nothing worse happens to you. The man went away and did what? He told the Jews that it was Jesus who'd made him well. So the second he realizes who it was that healed him, he goes and tattles on him, right? And tells the authorities, oh, I figured out the name of the person. He didn't have to do that. He could have just like disappeared. Now that he knew it was Jesus, he could have just kept going and saying, oh, I don't know who it is, and like protected Jesus from the scrutiny. And he does not do that.
It kind of proves that he never had any faith whatsoever in
Right.
the man that healed him.
Right.
I might disagree though, because he did have faith that the pool would hear him, which kind of shows he did have a faith in God that somehow God was going to heal him. He just thinks he has to do things a certain way.
Yeah. And it's unclear. I mean, we're only given so much of the character to understand his intentions, his
Right.
character, right? It seems like maybe he believed that the pool would heal him, but it also seems like he might have been stuck in being identified by his illness, right? I think that might be why Jesus comes and says, do you want to be healed? Because maybe he is so wrapped up in, I'm so thoroughly identified in what's wrong with me. I wouldn't know who I was if I didn't have this illness, right? We really don't know. That's an interpretation. Some people say it's reading too much into it. Some people think that it's why Jesus is asking the question. We really don't know.
Identified.
Because the man went and told the leaders in verse 16, therefore the Jews started persecuting Jesus because he was doing such things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answers them, my Father is still working, and I also am working. For this reason, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill Jesus, because he was not only breaking the Sabbath, but also calling God his own Father, thereby making himself equal to God. It seems like what Jesus is saying, if you think about the Sabbath, in the original, in Genesis, at the end of creation, God rests on the seventh day, instituting the Sabbath. The question is, what happens on the eighth day? In what way does God actually rest on the seventh day? He doesn't stop all work, because if he stops doing anything, then the world will just stop to exist, right? The world continues to exist because God holds it together, because Jesus decides to continue holding it together. So he's not resting from that. So some people say that God rested from his creative effort. He no longer created, so he stopped. If that's what you think it means that he rested on the seventh day, then he continues to rest. The eighth day, he's still resting, right? Because he's not in the active creative mode anymore, right? We tend to think of it as 6 days of work, seventh day you rest, and then 6 days we think of it as cyclical. And this is an argument that's happening in Jesus' time and before, of is God resting right now or is he working right now, right? That seems to be the question that Jesus is answering, even though they're not really asking the question. They're complaining about Jesus, but what does Jesus say? He says, my Father is still working, and I also am working. Implying God is not resting anymore. He rested on one day, and he's not resting anymore. Because I have the same authority as God, I'm not resting on the Sabbath either. That seems to be what he's saying, is that I have the same authority that God has to continue to do work on the Sabbath. Because it seems like they believe God is doing work on the Sabbath, upholding everything. God is receiving temple sacrifices, right? The Levites, the priests in the temple, are performing sacrifice. They're working, but they're allowed to because of the law. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So God is continuing to work. And Jesus is saying, I'm allowed to work because my Father is working. right? You see how his answer fits in with the question they're asking? Now, there's debate about whether what Jesus is saying here actually is a claim to divinity, to being equivalent with God. It seems like the text gives us the answer. They thought that it was. They thought he was saying he was equated to God. And he could have just said, oh no, that's not what I meant. But he doesn't. He identifies himself with God. And he will do that more explicitly in this chapter and the next. Good so far? Yep. So Jesus keeps talking to them. He says, the Son can do nothing on his own, but only what he sees the Father doing. Whatever the Father does, the Son does likewise. The Father loves the Son and shows him all that he himself is doing. And he will show him greater works than these, so that you will be astonished. Just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, so also the Son gives life to whomever he wishes. The Father judges no one, but has given all authority to the Son, so that all may honor the Son, just as they honor the Father. Anyone who doesn't honor the Son doesn't honor the Father who sent him. Very truly I tell you, anyone who hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life, and does not come under judgment, but has passed from death to life. So 2 things. Jesus is equating himself not only with the work of God, but with the other attributes of God as well. So he goes on and says, he sees what God sees, he does what God does, he judges the way God judges, and he hears what God tells him. Okay? He receives the honor of God. It seems like he's saying, God actually, it's hard to explain. The judgment that he's talking about. God is the one who actually weighs and determines, and Jesus is the one who carries out the judgment, I think. But in carrying out the judgment, Jesus equates himself with whatever honor God receives for being the one who judges the world. Because Jesus carries it out, so Jesus receives the same honor that God does as the one who judges everything. Right? So the love, the judgment, the honor, all of these things are wrapped up together in both Father and Son. This seems to be very explicit. Jesus is identifying himself with God. Right?
Yep.
He also says in 24, anyone who hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life.
Right.
Does not come under judgment, but is passed from death to life. Has passed already from death to life. Even in Jesus' time, this is still 1.5 years before the crucifixion, people can be in eternal life now. They don't have to wait until they die and go to heaven. They don't even have to wait for Jesus to die and go to heaven. Right? People who believe in Jesus' work. Peter, who will end up believing by the end of chapter 6, he passes from death to life when he believes. Right? So this is something, it's like the fancy word. We might have talked about this before. It's called realized eschatology. That's like their fancy theology word for today.
Like a spiritual awakening.
You guys know what eschatology is. The end times, right? The stuff that happens at the end of the world, the apocalypse, right? We think of like the book of Revelation. Realized means, we use it when we say like somebody has realized their potential. It's here, it's now, it's fulfilled. So this is eschatology that's happening now, right? John is kind of famous for this. We call it like the already but not yet. So some aspects of what John promises will happen in the future have already happened in Jesus. And some of them will happen actually in the future, okay? It seems like passing from death to life is something that happens with Jesus coming to earth. People who believe in him, even while he's on earth, pass from death to life. Now, like the resurrection of our bodies doesn't happen until later, right? But these sorts of things already happen. It's not that everything Jesus promises happens in the future. He promises things that we can receive now, today. Good? Can somebody read 25 to 30 for me?
Okay. Truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming, and now is, when the dead shall hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear shall live. For just as the Father has life in himself, even so he gave to the Son also to have life in himself. And he gave him authority to execute judgment, because he is the Son of Man. Do not marvel at this, For an hour is coming in which all who are in the tombs shall hear his voice, and shall come forth, those who did the good deeds to a resurrection of life, those who committed the evil deeds to a resurrection of judgment. I can do nothing on my own initiative. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, because I do not seek my own will, but the will of him who sent me.
Okay, so the first thing in 25, the hour is coming, so future, and is now here. Now, so this is what we're talking about. There are things that are coming in the future, and there are things that are happening now, and they're both, and we hold that in tension, right? Some things we don't know if they happen now or if they happen in the future. People will argue about, like, sanctification. So some people think that as a Christian, when you believe, you become sanctified. You are fully perfected, and you don't sin anymore. We disagree with that, right? We think of gradual, progressive sanctification. We become more like Jesus over time, but we don't actually become sanctified until we die. But that is a debate about this. Are the promises of God for us now or us in the future, right? And there's debate about all of them, right? Which of these things happen now and which of them happen in the future? This seems to be what we're talking about. In verse 30, Jesus says, I can do nothing on my own. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just. As he hears, meaning from God. So God tells him how to judge, and then he carries out the judgment, right? And that way his judgment is just, because he seeks not to do his own will, but whose?
God's.
The Father's will. So I think we talked about this last week, but it's the mutual exaltation of Father and Son. The Father does things and arranges things in such a way that when the Son acts according to the Father's will, the Son can receive the glory for it. And when he does, he points it all back to the Father and says, everything that I receive, I get from the Father. I'm only judging because the Father is telling me how to judge. So any honor you give me is honor that you give to the Father. And any honor you give to the Father is honor that you give to me. This is why Christians are so committed to Jesus is the only way, right? These things of, like, Jesus says later, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. There's, especially in our times, like, we live in a pluralistic society. There's people that we know who don't believe in Jesus, right? And a lot of people will try to say, oh, well, Jesus is one path to get to heaven, right? You can get to God, like the real God of the universe, through other means. These sort of passages seem to argue against that. No, if you don't honor the Son, there is no way for you to honor the Father, right? If you don't believe in the Son, there's no way for you to believe in the Father. It's impossible. And these are the texts that kind of lay that out theologically, why that's the case. It's one thing for us to just make the blanket statement, Jesus is the only way. These texts seem to explain why. Good? Good. Let's talk in 31 to the end. Jesus starts talking about testimony. We've talked about this before, how this is a really big theme in John. He's going to lay out 4 things that testify about himself. So can somebody read this passage for us? It's 31 to the end.
I'll read it.
Okay, and then everybody else be thinking about what are the things that Jesus is identifying, saying testify about him. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. If I were to testify on my own behalf, my testimony would not be valid. But someone else is also testifying about me, and I assure you that everything he says is true about me. In fact, you sent investigators to listen to John the Baptist, and his testimony about me was true. Of course, I have no need of human witnesses, but I say these things so you might be saved. John was like a burning and shining lamp, and you were excited for a while about his message. But I have a greater witness than John, my teachings and my miracles. The Father gave me these works to accomplish, and they proved that he sent me. And the Father who sent me has testified about me himself. You have never heard his voice or seen him face to face, and you do not have his message in your hearts because you do not believe me, the one he sent to you. You search the scriptures because you think they give you eternal life, but the scriptures point to me. Yet you refuse to come to me to receive this life. Your approval means nothing to me because I know you don't have God's love within you. For I have come to you in my Father's name, and you have rejected me. Yet if others come in their own name, you gladly welcome them. No wonder you can't believe. For you gladly honor each other, but you don't care about the honor that comes from the one who alone is God. Yet it isn't I who will accuse you before the Father. Moses will accuse you, yes, Moses, in whom you put all your hopes. If you really believed Moses, you would believe me, because he wrote about me. But since you don't believe what he wrote, how will you believe what I say?
Good, thank you.
Nice.
So what is Jesus identifying? He's saying, if I'm testifying about myself, my testimony's not true. That doesn't mean like Jesus is a liar if he's the only one saying it. It means, legally speaking, his testimony about his own actions won't hold up in court, right? So who does he call as a witness to testify about himself?
Moses.
John the Baptist.
Moses.
I heard Moses. We'll do them out of order, it's fine.
God.
Moses, God. I think there's one more. Scripture, I think, is probably wrapped up in Moses.
Okay.
I wrote it as a fifth separate thing. I wrote Moses as a fifth separate thing, but I think they're probably together. He also identifies the works that he does,
Oh, yeah.
right?
Miracles. Miracles.
Yeah. I have a testimony. The works that the Father has given me to complete, the very works that I'm doing, testify on my behalf. So it's not just that God is saying things about him. God is also doing things through him, right? So he's calling all four of these witnesses to say all of these things testify about me. The things that I'm saying are true. Not only because I'm performing signs, they point to the truth of what I'm saying about myself, right? We talk about them as signs and not miracles. He's not doing them just to do them. He's doing them to point to a greater spiritual reality, right? One of my favorite verses, this is kind of, I write it all the time, in 5:39 and 40. You search the scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life. But it's they that testify on my behalf. Yet you refuse to come to me to have life. Okay? Everything that we're doing in this class is meaningless if it doesn't actually lead you to seeking Jesus. Right? You can memorize the whole book. Right? You word for word, front to back, in Hebrew and Greek, you can memorize the whole Bible. And that won't do anything to benefit your eternal outcome if you don't seek Jesus for life. Right? And this seems to be his condemnation here. This is meaningful to me because I enjoy sitting and digging in and learning and reading all the commentaries and that sort of stuff. But if I don't actually do something with that, then it's meaningless. Right? And so I have this verse like written on postcards and hidden around so that I can remind myself about it. Because I can get so in the weeds of trying to figure things out and doing math when this is not a math question. Right? Does that make sense?
Yep.
Good. Any questions about 5? Okay, let's do John 6. After this, sometime after, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. So it says after this, he is not in Jerusalem anymore, right? He's up here in Galilee, okay? So there's been a cutscene, time jump. We don't know how much longer it is. There's a large crowd that was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. He's doing other signs that John is not telling us about. We know that. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down with the disciples. Maybe we're supposed to be thinking about like Sermon on the Mount, Moses going up the mountain. Mountains are kind of common places to have communion with God. So it might be that we're supposed to be thinking about these things, or it might be that he literally went up the side of a mountain and that's where he was. Because it's like a natural amphitheater, right? You can amplify your voice and speak to more people if you're at an elevated position. It could just be that that's the basics of it. We don't really know. We don't know how much to read into it. The Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. Okay, so there's Passover coming. Jesus is not going to Passover this year. He's been before. He will go again. He's not going this year. He is staying in Galilee for Passover. Okay? But what are we supposed to be thinking about in our minds when it says, hey, Passover's coming?
Sacrifice of the Lamb.
Good. We're supposed to be thinking about Exodus. We're supposed to be thinking about sacrifice. We're supposed to be thinking about God's provision, right? These things that the Jews are supposed to be thinking about in Jerusalem during Passover. right? He says Passover's coming, we're supposed to be thinking these things. Good? He looked up and saw the large crowd coming toward him, and Jesus says to Philip, where are we going to get bread for these people? He said it as a test for him, because he already knew what he was going to do. Philip said 6 months' wage would not be enough bread for each of them to get a little, right? It's just not enough. There's too many people. One of his disciples, Andrew, Peter's brother, said, well, there's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. Don't think of this as like big loaves of bread. These are probably like unleavened cakes, right? 5 barley cakes. This is a poor person's lunch,
Right.
right? This tells us it's barley loaves. The other gospels that record this story don't say barley. Barley indicates the poverty, right? And they're wafers, right? They're cakes. They are not, honking loaves of bread that everybody can tear off a piece of them, right? And the 2 fish are probably like little sardines, like salted fish that are kept preserved. I mean, this is not a big meal even for the kid, right? And Jesus said, sit the people down. Now there was a great deal of grass, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Jesus took the loaves and he gave thanks. What do we call it when we are in service and we get the bread and the juice? Communion. What's the fancy word for it? Eucharist. Right? That's like the 10-cent word. Eucharist means to give thanks. It's from the Greek word to give thanks. So maybe we're supposed to be thinking of that here, but I'm going to argue that we're not. Okay? So I think a lot of us look at this passage as talking about the Lord's Supper, the Lord's table, the communion. I don't think that's what we're talking about. He distributes the bread and the fish as much as everyone wanted, and when they were satisfied, he told the disciples to gather up the fragments so nothing may be lost. Mm-hmm. They gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, they filled 12 baskets. Mm-hmm. And when the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, this is indeed the prophet who's come into the world. We're not sure if there's supposed to be significance in like, there were 5 loaves and now there's 12 baskets. These are all symbolic numbers. So maybe, there's some people who really dig into it and say the 5 is supposed to represent the 5 books of the Torah, and the 12 is supposed to represent the 12 disciples, and the 12 disciples are replacing the books of the Torah. There's also 12 tribes in Israel, and so it doesn't necessarily have to be symbolic. People like to speculate. They thought he was the prophet, so Jesus realizes that they were going to come and make him a king by force. Why is this a problem?
Not supposed to be an earthly king. And also, the Messiah would also kind of attract the attention of Rome.
And also Rome, right? So there's 2 problems. One, Jesus doesn't want to be an earthly king. That is not his intent as the Messiah. And 2, it would probably get all of them killed, right? If Rome hears about them crowning a new king in Jerusalem, that's going to be a problem. So Jesus escapes, right? Now, this miracle, this sign, him feeding the 5,000, is the only miracle that's recorded in all 4 Gospels. It's the only one. Because John specifically pulls back and does not tell us all the miracles Jesus performs. This is the only one that overlaps with the miracles that happen in the Synoptics. Okay? They also, in the Synoptics, at least in Matthew, I think in Mark as well, the feeding of the 5,000 is followed by walking on water. And that's what happens next. So we're very familiar with the story. Evening comes, the disciples go out to sea. Jesus comes and walks along the water and says, it's I, don't be afraid. They got in the boat and they immediately reached the land where they were trying to go. I don't know how much we're supposed to read into this, right? He shows up and says, it is I, which is like the I am. He says, I am, don't be afraid. Mm-hmm. Some people will read into that and say he's announcing himself as God. I am. But some people say, no, like, that's the only way to say, it's me. Like, when you answer the phone, you say, this is, right? That's the only way to do it. And so there's debate about whether or not, I think in Mark's gospel, that's 100% what he's doing. He's walking along the water, they think he's a ghost, and he shows up and says, I am. I think that's what it's supposed to be intended, to make you think it's God walking on the water. I don't think that's what John is doing here. I think John has already come out pretty strong to say who Jesus is. I don't think he needs these subtleties to do it, the way that Mark uses subtleties. So they make it to the other side, and the crowd doesn't know where Jesus went because, right, they are over here, and now they saw a boat leave without Jesus, but then Jesus is gone. So they kind of like go up and around, I think, to follow where he went. So in 25, they said, Rabbi, when did you get here? And he says, you were looking for me not because you saw signs, but because you had your fill. Right? So there are people that are following Jesus who are not interested in anything that Jesus has to say. They're interested in the miracles. They're hoping to get something out of him. Right now, they're hoping for food. They got food yesterday. They probably want food today. Right?
Yep.
He says, don't work for the food that perishes. Right? I gave you food yesterday. It perished. Now you're here again because you want more food. But work for the food which endures for eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. It is on him that God the Father has set his seal. Then they said, well, what do we have to do to perform the works of God? And Jesus said, this is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent. So what is the work of God? Right? We think of like, oh, what is God's will for my life? Right? You hear this a lot, especially with like high school students, college students. What does God have for me? What's his will? What does it say right here? This is the work of God, that you believe in Jesus whom God has sent. That's it. That's the work, right? There's going to be a couple more of these. So they said, okay, you say we need to believe in you, and that's doing the work of God. But what sign are you going to give us so that we might see it and believe you? What work are you performing, right? Prove it. Which is silly because they're following him because they know he did signs. And they just ate the food yesterday.
That was yesterday, though.
But that was yesterday. And then what do? It's very clever. They say, can you prove it? Our ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness. As it's written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. So what are they bringing out? Food. Right? Hey, how do we know that what you're saying is true? Can you prove it to us? For example, just thinking off the top of my head, our ancestors ate the manna from heaven. Right? They want more food. And that's why they're here. It seems... it's funny, but that's why they're here. They say, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. Does anybody have a footnote? Does anybody's Bible tell them a verse that they're quoting in 631?
Yeah, Exodus 16:4, Psalm 78.
Nehemiah 9:15.
Yeah. I have a lot of those listed. I cannot...
Numbers 11:7.
I don't see the word for word in any of those verses. They tell the story of the manna coming down from heaven, but they don't say he gave them bread from heaven to eat. I could be wrong. I might have missed one. It seems like they are saying Moses gave our ancestors bread from heaven. What's wrong with that statement? Moses didn't do it, right? It came from God. So Jesus corrects them and says, truly, truly, I say to you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven. And now he switches gears. But it's my Father who gives you currently, right now, not your ancestors, gives you what?
The true bread.
The true bread from heaven. This is the bread of God. Or the bread of God is that which comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Who's he talking about? What's he talking about? He's talking about himself. Go ahead.
But I think some of the people are following Jesus so that they're gonna be fed, actually, food. They don't understand
that's it.
what he's trying to tell them.
Right. It seems like at this point, Jesus is trying to, I don't know how to say it politely. He intends in this chapter, in this encounter, to lose disciples. He has people following him who do not believe in him.
Right.
They are following for alternative reasons. They have ulterior motives.
Right.
Through this teaching, right, people are following him. People have followed him across the lake now. And in this moment, he has decided, I'm going to teach them some truth, and it's going to make them leave. He is not going to teach them easy things or avoid telling the truth in order to gather more people. That is not what he's about. So he has decided in himself to teach them things that will drive a wedge between genuine believers and people who are only there for the miracles. And this is what he has decided to teach them, is this discourse on the bread of life.
He's colored them.
What's that?
Culling them, like you cull the bad cattle out of the,
Right.
out of the.
Yes. The bread of God which comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. This is what makes me think that this is not really talking about the crucifixion so much as the incarnation, because he's specifically talking about him coming down from heaven, his original origin in heaven, right? So they say, give us this bread always. And what do they mean by that?
We want food forever.
You've got food that you can give us that will make us not need food anymore? Yeah, let's have some of that. Right? They completely miss the thing that he's talking about. So Jesus says to them, abundantly clear, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. But I said to you that you have seen me, and yet you don't believe. Jesus says, everything that the Father gives me will come to me, and anyone who comes to me I will never drive away. Right? So he seems to be adding on a spiritual component of why these people are not believing. He says, the Father gives people to me, and because the Father has given them, they come to me. And when they come to me, I keep them. Right? The people, because Jesus is right now driving people away. That's what he's doing in this in this teaching. But what he's saying is, if you're driven away by what I'm teaching, then you were not here in the first place. You are not on board. Right?
Then you are not given to me by God.
Right. That's the implication. Is you're here because you're hungry. You're not here because your heart has been awakened by God to pursue my teachings. He says, for I have come down from heaven, not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. This is very clear. This is the will of him who sent me. So again, this is Jesus's purpose. The will of God who sent Jesus, that Jesus should lose nothing of all that he has given him, but raise it up on the last day. Okay? This is indeed the will of my Father, that all who see the Son and believe in him may have eternal life, and I will raise them up on the last day. This seems repetitive. He's saying the same thing a couple of times. The way that God is working is that everyone God sends to Jesus, Jesus accepts and keeps and raises them up on the last day. There's no fallouts. This seems important because people are about to fall out right now. And I think the implication is, it's not because Jesus' words are inadequate. It's because their hearts are not in the right place. Right? Then the Jews began to complain about Jesus saying, I am the bread that's come down from heaven. And they were saying, isn't this Jesus, like the son of Joseph, and we know his mom and dad? How can he say I've come down from heaven? They are completely on a different level than he is. He is talking about things, he's talking about his cosmic origins in the universe. And they're like, yeah, but we know your dad. So obviously you didn't come from heaven, because like we remember you as a kid. Right? This is the argument.
Right.
So then, Jesus says, don't grumble, don't complain among yourselves. No one can come to me unless drawn by the Father who sent me. And I will raise that person up on the last day. This seems even more explicit. No one can come to me unless drawn by the Father. Everybody who's coming to Jesus is coming because God has drawn them in. Okay? It's also written in the prophets, they shall all be taught by God. Everyone who's heard and learned from the Father comes to me. Not that anyone has seen the Father except the one who's from God, right? I'm the only one who knows what I'm talking about. None of you have seen God. Very truly I say to you, whoever believes has eternal life. I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate manna in the wilderness and what? They died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever, and the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. This is why people get to thinking that this is about the Eucharist, communion, because he talks about eating his flesh. In all of the words that we say in church, we say, this is my body broken for you. It seems like John, writing as late as he did, would have known that that was the ritual words that we say during communion. Right? Those are the words recorded in Luke. Those are the words that Paul records. John is not using the word body. So it seems like he's talking about something a little different, especially because what sense would this make to anybody a year before the crucifixion. Right? They're saying that the Passover is happening in Jerusalem right now. So next Passover in a year is the one where Jesus is going to die.
Right.
So this is 1 year to the day before the crucifixion. What sense does this make at all for him to be saying, I'm giving my body for the sins of the world or whatever? It makes sense for him to say that at the Last Supper, the night before he dies, because then his disciples are going to get it tomorrow and understand what he means. This doesn't make any sense to the audience that he is speaking to.
But it's gonna separate them.
It's going to separate them because they're upset saying, how can he give us his flesh to eat? That's against the rules. Cannibalism, drinking blood. We are not allowed to do these things and we all know it. Right? They're thinking on the very literal physical level instead of the spiritual level.
Right.
So Jesus says to them, I truly say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. So they got upset when he said, eat my flesh. And now he raises it even more gross, even more specific, even more against the law. Not only eat my flesh, drink my blood too.
Right.
Right?
Good stuff.
Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood have eternal life, and I will raise them up on the last day. My flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them. I think this is what he's talking about. The abiding. We call it the mystical union. The way that when you become a believer, you are united with Christ in a mystic way, meaning not in a physical way, not in a way that you performed, in a way that the Holy Spirit performs to unite you with Christ. That's what he's talking about here. Eating his flesh and drinking his blood is part of this miraculous, mystical, spiritual union that we have as believers with God. Good?
Yep.
10 o'clock, let's see. This is the bread, this is 58, that came down from heaven, not like that which our ancestors ate, and they died. But the one who eats this bread will live forever. He said these things while he was teaching in the synagogue at Capernaum. So again, he's up here in Capernaum, and he's talking about the reality of a true Passover, as opposed to the one that's happening down here, right? The thing that will last forever instead of having to come back to Passover every year, right? This will eventually culminate in him saying, I'm the Passover lamb, right? But right now I think it suffices to say he's the new manna, right? In the same way that he has replaced maybe purity, like rituals in the wedding at Cana, the washing of hands, maybe in the same way that he's replaced the temple when he cleanses the temple in John 2, maybe in the same way that he is replacing those things, he's also replacing the daily provision that God gave in the Old Testament with his own presence being the daily provision from God. His own presence, his own ability to be with people and nurture them and feed them is what he's talking about. Maybe. One last thing before we go. Many of his disciples heard it and said, this is verse 60, this teaching is difficult. Who can accept it? This is what I'm talking about. He is driving people away because they think that his teachings are difficult to understand. Jesus is aware that his disciples were complaining and said, does this offend you? Then what if you were to see the Son of Man, ascending to where he was before? It's the spirit that gives life, the flesh is useless. The words I've spoken to you are spirit and life, implying you don't get them because you're not given it by the Spirit. Among you there are some who don't believe. Jesus knew from the first those who didn't believe and the one who would betray him. For this reason, so this is it. This is the point of him teaching this in verse 65. For this reason I've told you that no one can come to me unless it's granted by the Father. He has explained what's happening on the spiritual level. You guys don't believe because it wasn't granted to you by the Father. Because of this, many disciples turned back and no longer went with him. So Jesus asked the 12, do you also want to go away? And Peter says, Lord, to whom can we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and know that you are the Holy One of God. This is the response that Jesus is trying to elicit. This is why he went through this whole teaching about these difficult and kind of weird things, was to get Peter to say this and to make everybody else recognize that they are not on board with what Peter has just said. Peter says, we can't go anywhere else. You have the words of life. Everything that you're saying is true, so why would we go anywhere else? And everybody else doesn't believe, and so they are not on board with it. So of course they're going to go somewhere else. right? And Jesus says, didn't I choose you, the 12, yet one of you is a devil. He was speaking of Judas Iscariot.
Right.
For he, though one of the 12, was going to betray Jesus. John lays this out for us very early, that Judas is going to be the one to betray Jesus, and that Jesus knows. Because in some Gospels, Jesus seems to be caught by surprise when he gets betrayed.
Right.
And John does not want to give that illusion at all. Him being betrayed is always part of the plan, and he always knew it was coming. Right? Because Jesus can't get to the cross without Judas betraying him. So even when he picks Judas, he knows exactly what Judas is going to do. Maybe that's the reason he picked him, was because he needed somebody to get him onto the cross.
Did
Right.
Jesus know at that point that he was gonna be the one to betray Jesus?
Yes. Yeah.
I don't know if Judas knew, but Jesus.
I don't know if Judas knew.
but Jesus.
We have no way of knowing Judas's interior mind.
Yeah.
I think John is the one who tells us that Judas was stealing from the money
Right.
to make him seem more corrupt. But I don't think Judas knew he was going to betray Jesus until he did. Jesus always knew. And John makes that very clear. I mean, this is chapter 6. And Jesus doesn't die for 11 more chapters. And he already knows it's going to be Judas. Right? He is laying the groundwork because John wants all of us to know Jesus is in charge of the whole thing. Right? He tells Pilate, you wouldn't have any authority over me unless God gave it to you. Right? I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. And Jesus believes that the whole time. Right? Good?